Well, I'm excited. I think we have a really great panel prepared for you all, and definitely we will have time for question and answers that will come a little later. So try to hold off. If it's really pressing, I think Thompson may give you a shout, but overall we'll hold the questions for a little later. So with that, I'll let Thompson introduce.
Thank you. Jasmine, I'm Clemson Smith Muniz, class of 79, past president of ALA. Just stepped down after 6.5 years of service. Also, besides Jasmine, who took over this spring, I want to recognize other board members present here, Dr. Juan Luis Ferrer and Nicolás Rodriguez. And for you, I see many young alumni here, like Edgar, Oscar, back for their number 5, back for the first reunion. Glad to see them. For me, it's special because during my term as president of ALA, we tried hard to foster closer relationships with undergraduates in La Casa Latina. And they're among the first kids that I met when I got involved with alumni here. And I knew him as a juniors, sophomores, juniors, and seniors, and it's good to see him now back at Penn for the first reunion. We're here to talk about immigration reform inertia, and which is a pressing issue today in America. And I tried to put together a distinguished panel. And I say distinguished because we start with Dr. Emilio Parrado, who is professor of sociology, chair of the sociology department, and director of Latin American and Latino studies at Penn, and a man who has spent the last few years studying the impact of immigration in this country. You can, I think we'll learn one thing from this panel, that it's a much diverse, broader, complex issue than just immigrants sneaking in over any border or undocumented students. And we also have David Bennion, who's a Philadelphia-based lawyer specializing in immigration, and one who has defended a number of undocumented students at Penn. I think at Penn we're fortunate. We have a number of students who are open about their status. They're what you call dreamers or undocumented students, but they're here at Penn. They're part of the Penn family. Penn is a private university, has the right to step wherever it wants, and they're productive. And the thing is, they've been brave to come forward and fight for the rights of other undocumented students. And we have one of them here with us, which is Diana. Diana was one of the longest names undergraduates. She uses her. She is class of 15, majoring in anthropology and health. Yes, thank you. And she is a student that she's been here in the States over 21 years. Her family came from Mexico, grew up in the Washington and Seattle area, and she is the face, one of the faces, many faces of this problem that is affecting this country. So we'll go straight into the panel, and I think the first question here is, I think here we fight over immigrants, over policy against or about immigrants. But shouldn't the debate in Congress, shouldn't the debate in societies be about a policy about immigration?
Okay, so I'm going to start. So first of all, thank you all for coming here and for taking time on this beautiful Saturday to listen to these issues. The question about the distinction between immigrants and immigration, I think it's something important to keep in mind when we try to think about what to do with the political decisions that we have to make. And you hear a lot in the discourse that the problem of immigration is a problem, and the immigrant problem, and the real problem at the end of the day is a political problem, it's what political decisions we make about immigration and immigrants. And the U.S. has an ambivalent sort of attitude towards immigrants, immigration, and diversity more generally. On the one hand, you hear It's a country of immigrants, and it's a very diverse country, value diversity, produces, has the image of the melting pot. And, but if you look historically, every time there is a wave of immigration, dramatic changes in the composition of the U.S., you have, at the same time that you have people welcoming immigrants, you have a very negative reaction towards the changes that are being perceived as so dramatic. Today we're living one of those periods of a very negative reaction towards immigration, immigrants, and minorities in general. If you want to compare this historically with a period in the U.S., unfortunately, this is not new. You can go back to the 1920s, and I can bring you quotes from what people say in the 1920s and just change, instead of talking about Eastern Europeans, mainly Jewish, and Southern Europeans, mainly Catholic Italians and the Irish, I can change it to Mexicans, and you hear the same reaction. And so it's not new. At that time, the climate produced one of the most racist pieces of legislation in U.S. history, the 1924 Immigration Act, that basically closed the immigration of Jews and Eastern European. Hopefully we will not get to that point in this period in time, and we're going to have a more rational response to these changes. So one of the problems that we have in the discussion is that we don't distinguish between the issue of immigration from the issue of immigrants. And what is it, another way of putting it is immigration policies should refer to how we deal with the people coming in and entering the country. When we talk about immigrants, we're talking more about people who are settled in the U.S. And what do we do with people that we have here? And the two discourses get confused. For instance, the issue of the undocumented population is how we deal with people who are here. This is, the undocumented population are negative for the U.S. It's a contradiction in terms, because whatever negative effect they had it already. So this is not addressing the issue. It's a way of solving some immigration problem. It's just basically not addressing the issue that a portion of the U.S. population is not a full member of the U.S. society. The issue of immigration relates to how we regulate, or how can we affect who comes in, how they come in, what skills they have, and all that discussion about regulating the flow of immigrants. And the two discussions need to be addressed. And it's unclear whether they have to be addressed separately for legislation, or they have to be together. I go back and forth about, dealing, having a piecemeal approach, that we deal with the issue of the Dreamers in the U.S. and we concentrate on the Dream Act, or going for comprehensive immigration reform, and you're going to see that the discussion goes back and forth, and there are different strategies. Sometimes people go back to saying, let's just solve one problem at a time, to saying, let's solve all of them together at a time. And but there are two separate, very different issues. One of the things that's different from the 1920s is that at that time, lack of documentation was not a main issue for the immigrant population. So this is not because we're not undocumented, because after 1924 people kept coming, and it produced a lot of undocumented population at that time either. That's why we had in 1965, it was until 1965 that population became, but it was much smaller. The number of undocumented, a bunch of factors closed the border, not just legislation, the wars, the crisis, and so forth. So at that time, the immigrant population was not really divided between a legal and an illegal immigrant population. Today we have that problem. And so if before, immigrants were able to overcome whatever negative environment they faced from the U.S. because they could still work, and they could still buy a house, and they could still buy a car and do all the stuff. Today we're having a different situation. Immigrants are undocumented immigrants, their opportunities are being blocked. And it's a legal restriction on social mobility, which is the worst thing that we can create. It's affecting not only immigrants, but their descendants. And so that should be a priority. There's no reason, objective reason, for why we don't deal with that problem. It's mainly a political discussion that we're having, and there are only two solutions to that problem that I can think of. One is we deport lots of people, pretty much everybody, or we give them papers.
Emilio,
Yeah.
you mentioned, let's put some numbers here, because let me ask you the questions. What's the total population of this country right now? 320 million. 320 million. What is a conservative estimate of undocumented immigrants?
The estimates are around 11 million.
So like 3% of the current population. Okay. Well, you said we should be thinking about immigration and immigrants. So what's the birth rate in this country? How many people are born in this country every year?
In the U.S., around 4 million births happen every year.
And how many people die?
And 2 million deaths.
So it means is 2 million enough to sustain a population, or we know that birth rates have declined, so we need immigration, right?
Yeah.
This country to survive and prosper does need immigration at some point.
The immigration is a reality. It's a reality for the U.S., it's a reality in Europe. Every rich society these days has to deal with immigration. The percent foreign born in the U.S. is 12%. The percent foreign born in Canada is 20%. Percent foreign born in Australia is 25%. In Germany is 10%. So the U.S., again, this goes back to the image of the U.S. as being exceptional, and this is only just a U.S. problem. But really, immigration is a reality that all rich countries face because of historical reasons, demographic reasons, economic growth reasons, where jobs are, and so forth. So what's unacceptable is not addressing it. And you know, at the end of the day, you make your call, you take your position, but you cannot just ignore it. And what we're doing so far is just ignoring the political discussion at the same time that we're having massive deportations, which is a new era in terms of what we're living in the U.S.
David, so this leads to you. If we have massive deportation, and I think maybe that's been one state in the Obama administration that have had more deportations under any precedent in the last 6 years, I'm curious, do immigrants, undocumented immigrants, do they have legal rights?
Yes, they do, and it's a good question that brings up some other points that are not often widely discussed. Immigrants, for instance, are covered by the Sixth Amendment right to counsel. They're covered by the Fourth Amendment right to be free from unlawful searches and seizures by law enforcement. They enjoy many of the other rights that we think of as constitutionally protected rights. However, there are many failings in the legal system that lead to the situation that Emilio discussed, of people's opportunities and their social mobility being blocked. Immigration violations, by and large, are civil, not criminal offenses. Yet we see many immigrants, roughly 35,000 a year, and 30,000 at any given point in time detained, essentially in prisons. And I kind of shy away even from the word detained, because it tends to obscure what is really going on. They're jailed, they're in prison. Families being split apart, parents and children living in fear of the knock at the door or the workplace raid. And so I feel like even though there is a space carved out in theory under the Constitution and certain other laws, it's very limited in practice. And so taking a step back maybe from the immediate political discussions that many of us are familiar with, comprehensive reform in Congress, economic issues that are often discussed about, you know, who's going to do farm work, who's going to work in the food industries. But can we take a step back and think about what are fundamental rights that could help us see our way out of this situation to a better, more just society? There are certain rights that are international human rights that are recognized in many treaties that should apply, that should make the situation better than it is, but are also limited and restricted in practice. One is the right to life, and we see, unfortunately, immigrants in detention sometimes not being given necessary medical care and actually dying in jail. We see abuses by the Border Patrol at the border, and immigrants being shot even on the Mexican side of the border with very few consequences for law enforcement. The right to freedom should be recognized. Often it's not, as I mentioned. The right to family life is severely restricted for undocumented immigrants. And then there's a recognized right to leave a country. But that right is essentially meaningless without a corresponding right to enter other countries. One notable example of this happened during World War II. And you know, some of the narrative about World War II has developed in the decades after the war, where the U.S. at the time was really not very welcoming to refugees from the Nazi regime, in particular Jews. As Dr. Parrado mentioned, the laws explicitly discriminated against Jews at that time. And so there was a ship called the St. Louis of refugees escaping from Germany that came to the U.S. to request sanctuary, to ask for refuge, and was essentially blocked and sent back, and a large number of those Jews were returned to the death camps and perished during the war. So we see that the right to leave a country doesn't give us much without a corresponding right to enter. And then I would also encourage us to think about other rights that should be recognized. One being the right to remain. And that more specifically applies to undocumented people in the U.S. The right to remain in their communities, where many have lived for years and contributed, to remain with their families. The right to return. The laws are written in a way to essentially trap a large number of undocumented people inside the U.S., in particular Mexicans and Central Americans, who, upon leaving the U.S. to go visit family or whatever the case may be, are trapped outside and really in an impossible situation, being separated from family on both sides of the border. So those are some of the more fundamental legal, but also societal and cultural issues that I think need to be better discussed in order for us to deal with some of the more immediate legislative issues.
Which seems to me a good point to bring in Diana Estefania Estrada Agu. You know, your story is fascinating, and I don't know where to start. Like, do I ask you first, when did you find out you were undocumented? Or should I just go more basic, say, how is it, you know, for the benefit of most of us, how is it to be raised, to grow up in this country, not knowing you have papers?
Yeah. So, I mean, before I do want to speak to both points that have been brought up, I think this is an issue of comprehensive immigration reform. That's something I feel like I'm an advocate of. One, as a student advocate, right, because one of the issues without comprehensive immigration reform is that we start stratifying our immigrant population into a worthy and unworthy immigrant. And the icon of that completely then influences what our policies look like. And as a student advocate, that's something I'm completely against. That being said, and then as someone who is an undocumented immigrant in this country, I think the lack of comprehensive immigration reform then collapses the dynamics
that issue for us, right? So like David was able to go through a lot of what those nuances and intricacies look like, but as someone who lives in that life, the ways in which it impacts your life every single day, some of those things I didn't even realize until I got here to Penn, because I thought those were normal things, right? So like a primary health physician, it wasn't until I took my first like health management class here, my sophomore year, that I realized that I had never had one. And I didn't even know what that meant. And that I, as someone who was raised in public clinics, like I thought that that was how one received care. But I first learned that I was undocumented, I think I was 6 years old, honestly. I remember my parents always being very open with me about things that I could or could not do or could not say because yo no tenía papeles. So colloquially, like I did not have documentation. So I've known my entire life. But I was also raised in a state that luckily has laws in place that I did not constantly feel, for the most part, in fear of my status or of deportation. My family has gone through ICE raids. I have had family members who've been deported, who are very close to me. So like that is something that I've constantly been thinking about. But I don't think in comparison to some of the stories I've heard of my peers being raised in other states, more conservative states. But when I was applying to come to university, that was when I think I was hit the hardest. I come from a very low income family, and so finding out that most of the scholarships I wanted to apply to, I could not. For example, one of the major scholarships is the Gates Millennium Scholarship. I was not able to apply to that. Or even here now, in thinking of my transition out of undergraduate, I can never apply to Fulbright. There are so many things that I am not able to do because they're federally funded, and so even in the basic eligibility requirements, I'm not able to apply. And so when I was applying to school, I knew I needed some sort of full ride because that was the only way in which I was going to be able to pay for school. Luckily, Penn gave me that, but I applied to 18 schools simply because I needed financial aid. I didn't have necessarily the privilege of like a first, second, third choice. I applied to schools that my high school counselor, she legitimately called each individual school and said, do you give money to undocumented students? If so, what does that aid package usually look like? She helped me compile a list of schools, and those were the 18 schools that I applied to, and I hoped for a good fit, and luckily I found one.
Emilio, if I'm President Obama and name you my immigration czar, where do we start? What would you like to see done? Can we do like a 4 or 5 bullet point of main issues? We read immigration. We're talking immigration, not immigrants.
I would give everybody papers, no penalties. I would think carefully about Mexico and Central America, and so give them a different status. And I will revise immigration legislation every 3 years. When you look at what we have in terms of immigration, how countries deal with immigration, the best way to deal with immigration is to every 3 years you revise how things go and you adapt to the reality of immigration. As much as I know about history and stuff like that, nobody can predict the future. I don't know where immigrants are going to be coming from. I don't know how many are we going to need. I don't know what skills they're going to bring. And I can try to play a little bit with that, but social forces tend to be a lot more powerful than any regulation that I can have. But now, this means assuming that we're willing to deal with immigrants. And now, if I don't want immigrants, I want to close the border, if I want to just pick some immigrants or stuff like that, things like that, that's where we get in trouble. Talking about the current immigration reform, things to look at is these issues that I just told you about. How much are we going to try to influence the reality of immigration? If we try to influence the reality of immigration, we create problems. A big one is how punitive are we going to be? Are we going to make people go back to get papers in Mexico and then re-enter? Are we going to charge them $10,000? Are we going to every one of those punitive actions that we put in the legislation is going to work against the success of the legislation. Not just punitive actions on immigrants, but also punitive actions on employers. One of the worst things about 1986 immigration reform was that they be penalized employers. So before 1986, undocumented immigrants worked like legal immigrants with no penalty in terms of wages. But after 1986, employers started hiring them under the book, and so they started making less money. When immigrants are making less money, everybody else starts making less money because they're competing. So the other thing to look at: are we going to treat different countries differently, or are we going to have a global immigration policy? And how much are we going to try to select the immigrants that we get? This discussion, you're going to see it, and it's very, very powerful, and it's very tricky discussion, but has to do, at the bottom line, has to do with, are we going to have family reunification, or we're going to just look at immigrants based on human capital or skills? And again, you don't have family reunification if you have a husband that's working here and wants to bring his wife is going to come here and is going to come undocumented. And a lot of the undocumented population that we have in the US today actually has the right to be here. The thing is that because of legal restrictions, they don't qualify. And countries, there are many examples of countries revising immigration. In France, they don't produce undocumented population because every 3 years they have an amnesty. And Spain has had a few amnesties. The last time we had an amnesty was in 1986, and that's almost 30 years ago. And if you think about it, 30 years, 11 million, it was not so bad. And so it's not, we don't have such a, we're not, this juncture is actually not that terrible. If you think that this is after 30 years since the last time we regularized this. So I would be very generous. And, but I would be willing to negotiate with anybody who sort of agrees that we need the immigrants and we have to deal with immigrants. The problem that we're having is that in the discussion is that I just want to close the border. And then there's no discussion.
Okay, so closing borders, I'm going to go to David now. And we've talked about this, and again, these are approximate numbers, but if I understand correctly, 40% of those 11 million undocumented are not people who snuck through the border, right? These are people who overstayed the visas. These are people who came here as tourists, as students, work or whatever, and then simply stayed. And if I'm also correct, it's not only a Latino issue, but after Latinos, the two largest numbers of undocumented residents are Asian Americans, Chinese primarily, and Irish. But somehow this seems to be a Latino problem. Am I correct? This is how complex this issue is. It's not only a Latino problem, it's also Asian American, it's Asian problem, European problem.
Yes, definitely. The undocumented population is more diverse than is commonly understood in public discussions. However, Latinos are disproportionately affected by the restrictive and harsh enforcement policies that we see now, and are the overwhelming majority of people who are deported. And I see that playing out in the activist sphere in a couple of different ways. Latinos lead the immigrant rights movement, if you can refer to it as a unitary movement, which there are some issues with that. But partly out of necessity, partly out of having strength in numbers, common language and culture has led to the public face of undocumented immigration being Latino. But it is a problem in some ways because other communities often feel like they don't have as much of a voice in the activism and changing the laws, and also are more afraid, I think, to identify as undocumented, and feel more isolated often. sometimes can blend in better, can pass as documented. For instance, in Philadelphia, there are significant West African undocumented populations who, at least the young people, grow up essentially as African Americans, and nobody knows that they're undocumented until they get caught up sometimes in a deportation process. The Eastern Europeans are another example that we see in the Northeast. Polish, Russians, other Eastern Europeans, who, if it could be acknowledged that it is an issue that affects a diverse population, then these groups could work together better, I think, and have a stronger political voice.
As a lawyer, do you also agree with Emilio's stance of if you were the government trying to reform immigration, you would be more generous or lenient?
I would. As a lawyer and an activist, I would probably take it beyond what most people would be comfortable with and essentially flip the presumption to a presumption of open borders, which could only be overcome in certain extraordinary cases. Right now it's kind of the opposite. There's a presumption of closed borders, and there's an assumption, a misconception, that if you go about things the right way, if you fill out the right paperwork, that you can A, immigrate to the U.S., not just to visit, but to live permanently, or B, that if you're here out of status, undocumented, that you just have to fix your status, fill out the paperwork, that people are actively, intentionally flouting the laws when they could resolve the situation easily. Those are all falsehoods. So what we have is a de facto closed system where the vast majority of the global population can't come to the U.S. to live, and many can't even come to visit. And so I think that's just totally wrong to look at it that way. People raise the objection, well, it'll swamp the U.S. economy, we'll have major security threats. These fears are overstated in my opinion. I think it would actually have a very positive impact on the global economy, not just the U.S. economy. But more than that, it's an issue of justice and basic human rights. And so in my opinion, that's the most important factor.
If I could touch on, so like something that really called to me that you were talking about was sort of like inaccessibility of knowledge and inaccessibility of like resources, right? And that's something that I feel like is very much so pertinent to the people who are immigrants in this country and are undocumented. So like for example, like my family is one of those families that actually overstayed visas. That's the current situation in which we are. My family, luckily, my parents did have some sort of advice from some sort of lawyers. I don't really know how that played out, but they knew to keep documentation of everything from the moment they first came into this country, even documentation of like our awards as we were raised, because at some point they knew that like our character would be put into question if we were able to ever apply for citizenship, right? So my parents have like great documentation of every move we've ever made, but that's not generally the case, right? And like really important documents that I didn't even know were important, that are like this tiny, get lost along the years. And like when I was applying for my DACA status, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, that gives you a legal work permit for 2 years. You renew that work permit as long as the legislation is in standing. My application was 85 pages, and I never thought that was going to be the case. It also cost almost up to $500, and that was a bill that I had to front because my parents could not provide me with that money. So that completely affected my financial aid situation for that semester, if not that entire year at Penn. But when I was applying to that and realizing all the kinds of documentation that they needed for me, like I was in a lot of anxiety because I really was like, at what point was I supposed to know that I was supposed to have this documentation? And I called my father, and luckily he had all of it, right? But like I said, some of those documents, like I would have just thrown out a long time ago. or I would have maybe not even kept in the first place. Like we talk in our, luckily we do have a community here at Penn now of undocumented students, and some people talk about how like their parents don't even want any record of them being undocumented, so they don't keep that form of documentation. That's an inaccessibility of knowledge, and that's a direct reason as to why some people are not able to apply to some of the legislation that they would otherwise have been eligible for.
Let me mention something else about immigration legislation and discussion that we're having. 9/11 was very damning for discussions about immigration, and it really it really created a lot of new terms that before were moving in a different direction. The big one is we're not talking to the sending countries, and we're not talking. We 9/11 moved immigration into the Department of Homeland Security, so it became an issue of internal security of the U.S. instead of international relations or foreign trade or whatever. And before, if you remember, Bush and Fox were jointly talking about how this is a problem that the U.S. has, Mexico has. The best way to deal with it is binationally. If you want to know who comes to the U.S., if they want to know if they're criminals or not, what better way of knowing it than to talk to Mexicans or whoever country is sending immigrants. But we are looking at the issue of immigration just very locally, and just as a U.S. Internal program works against us. The same thing. That's why we have so many problems at the border. That's why, because we don't have an open conversation. One thing that could be included in that conversation is addressing what are the factors that push people to come to the U.S. If we really want to reduce the people trying to come to the U.S. from Mexico, what's the best way to do it? Probably is to working with the Mexican government in some things that can reduce the push to migrate and so forth, and that would regulate the flow. And it might be cheaper than some of the money that we spend on border enforcement or deportation or things like that. But we're not having that discussion, and that's very detrimental for finding a solution.
So David, how do you gauge, when you're dealing with prosecutors, with the government, what do they say? Just they're sealants who believe that immigrants should not be here, or they're just bureaucrats enforcing the current law?
Yeah, I think government attorneys and adjudicators, immigration bureaucrats do get very invested in the system because their job is to look at an individual application or an individual case and just make a decision based on the existing law. There's a range of viewpoints within that community. Some are, I would say, anti-immigrant, some are really not. But the existing legal system is so small and so limited in its scope and its vision that there's a real limit to what can be done in the absence of legislation. There's a limit to what can be done with legislation without a broader review and almost a rethinking, a fresh start about immigration and the immigration laws. Comprehensive reform, as it's, there's this idea that the Senate bill that was passed last summer is the be-all and end-all. It's sort of an endpoint of the immigrant rights movement, that it's going to solve immigration once and for all. That's actually an argument that people have against it. They say, well, that's what the '86 amnesty was supposed to do. It was supposed to solve immigration. And it's not a realistic view. Emilio's idea of sort of a statute of limitations on being undocumented, like periodic amnesties, is a great idea. And just a constant sort of adaptation, tweaking of the laws is another, rather than trying to get everything done in one politically impossible bang. But beyond that, really opening our imagination and our vision of how should immigration be regulated? How should we think of ourselves with respect to immigrants? claiming that we're a nation of immigrants, but does that mean Ellis Island and nothing past that? And so, you know, you don't often see these questions discussed in the news media. Usually it's, well, the Republicans are obstructing, the Democrats want the legislation, there's a very specific objective, and once it's achieved, then that's the end of the discussion. That's very simplistic.
Diana, talk about the undocumented community at Penn. It's large. You probably know more than you know, but I'm curious. Why were you so willing to be open? You and several others, like Tanya Chaides, who was a regional speaker, but she got an Ivy Award today. She's out getting it right now. And but I know this through Johnny and La Casa. I know several open undocumented students, but I think the community is much larger. It's not only Latino, so I'm curious. You know, how big is the community to your knowledge, and why are you so willing to be so open?
Yeah. Actually, I mean, David, we were talking about this before the panel began, that the climate of students at Penn who have been undocumented and who have been very out about their status has changed. I mean, Johnny probably attests probably 180% from like where I was when I first came in the fall of 2010. So that's one thing that'll begin the story. But I think first and foremost, I have done advocacy for the majority of my life, and I think I've seen the benefits of being very out about your identities and all of those complexities. And I also serve. So predominantly here, a lot of my advocacy has been in the LGBT community. I do a lot of queer advocacy for queer people of color. And so that's like a huge issue for a lot of people in the queer community is that if they are undocumented, they don't even feel like they're in a safe, in terms of just like mental, emotional, but larger structural space to even be out about their sexual identity or their gender expression. So the idea of ever being out about their immigration status is like not even on the table at all. Like that's not even where they are in terms of advocacy. So as student advocates, even if they are comfortable talking about their LGBT status, like immigration will not be a part of the conversation. We're trying to move forward with that in an queer identity, but that's still slow in coming. It's probably how David was talking about, one of the communities that don't necessarily identify with the immigration movement right now in the United States, but who we would get a lot of benefit from in the conversation if we were able to include them. But when we first got here, as freshmen, I was talking to David about how actually it was very like a covert, like there are connections being made between students who are undocumented, older students with younger students via email, but still very secretly. So
face to face, or were there code words? Or how did you learn to trust each other?
So at first it began with emails, like people who were unnamed. I had reached out to my advisor. She had never worked with undocumented students before, so I actually found a different advisor who had worked with undocumented students because my high school counselor had been incredibly supportive in my transition, and she was like, don't settle. You need people who are going to help you maneuver that system, who have worked with students like you before. And when I had met with my new advisor who had worked with undocumented students, I had spoken to her that I wanted to be able to be connected with someone who was. So she connected me with a sophomore at the time. Johnny was actually pulled into that conversation because he's always been a very, very supportive person on this campus for us. And so we were connected in that way, but I did not even know who she was until I actually sat down and met with her. And it turned out that she was someone who I already knew very well via like another program at Penn. And that ended up being the case for the next year and a half or so. A lot of students that I was already really great friends with turned out to be also undocumented. And I think when my class, the class of 2014, I'm taking a fifth year, so not 2014, but the class of 2014, when we all started to realize how many of our own friends within our class were undocumented, we said, listen, we need to create some sort of community in which which like this is a thing, and we can sort of take the younger classmen under our wing and help them with financial aid, with housing, with, you know, how do you pick classes with professors that might not be comfortable with you talking about how you're undocumented, or like career-wise. I had mentioned before, like I'll never be able to apply to a Fulbright. There are so many fellowships that I will never be able to apply to. How do you deal with that? How do you deal with the mental health piece of being undocumented at a university that is supposed to be able to hand you everything you've ever dreamed of, and that's not the case. So it's awesome, PIR, Penn for Immigrant Rights, and a few other students, they were able to found that organization, it's a student organization here at Penn. They do an orientation every semester, if they can, to bring in students to sort of ask whatever questions you would ever have, whether that be about student conduct, student safety, student life, and they sort of answer those questions for the underclassmen every single year. And now they started to do trainings for student groups, faculty, staff. That's the idea that 4 years later, we never had that my freshman year. So it's awesome to be able to see that. Luckily, I can now say that we have a community here, but even members within our community don't feel comfortable identifying as undocumented outside of like our closed door, like we're hanging out on a Friday type setting, because there are still a lot of internal things within the university and in the United States in general that are problematic and are very scary or are very frustrating for someone who is undocumented.
This is both for Emilio and David. Is it the younger generation leading the charge about undocumented students and undocumented residents?
Well, the younger cases like Diana are a peculiar case within the undocumented, because you can very easily make the argument that you don't punish kids for their parents' behavior, and this is so that argument can be very powerful, but not enough, I guess. The problem in general with immigration and with immigrants and undocumented in the U.S. is why would you give them papers? What argument can you make? What kind of rights can you claim that immigrants have that's necessary for politicians to give them papers? And that argument is not easy. It's not easy. On the one hand, you can think about immigration is a human right, and so immigrants have rights just for being human, and the United Nations recognizes migration as a human right, and the Organization of American States finds the U.S. in violation of human rights in terms of its deportation policies, but obviously the U.S. doesn't get you that far if you go in terms of human rights. You can think it has workers' rights, because these are people, remember all these people that we have undocumented here, these are people who are working in the U.S. for 10, 15, 20 years. They get no benefits, they claim no benefits, so at the end of the day it's a workers' right, really, you can think about as a workers' rights. Unions in the U.S. don't always defend immigrants for some reason. In other countries, unions are the first ones to defend immigrants because they are their constituency, but in the U.S., unions don't always defend immigrants. Another reason is a sort of a civil right. You have people that are members of the U.S. that don't have access to all of the civil rights. And if you think about it, it was not until the civil rights movement that in the 1960s that immigration reform happened in the U.S. And it was in connection with the civil rights, so it was 1965 immigration reform. Today we're very far from any of those situations. So why is it that, what kind of argument can you make? It's actually not easy for advocacy stuff. It's not easy to make those arguments. That's on the negative sort of pessimistic side. Are we going to see immigration reform? I don't know. Evaluate the situation. It's not very clear why politicians will have to do it. On the optimistic side, is immigration is having an effect on the composition of the U.S. and on the ethnic composition of the U.S. Latino families. You just cannot find a Latino family that has not been marred by undocumented immigration. So that's something that affects. They can be citizens Diana was telling me that her brother born in the U.S. sooner or later is going to vote. And so you have citizens that are being marked by being undocumented. It's an immigrant issue, not just a Latino issue in that sense, because if you look at Asians in California, the people talk about Latinos voting for Democrats, but Asians in California overwhelmingly voted Democratic, and there are more Asian voters in California than African American today. And so if politicians see that, that might be, Texas is talking about going blue, and a lot has to do with the change in demographics of the U.S. So that might be on the positive side about why they might want to do it now. Alternatively, they can restrict voting, they can redistrict, and there are other ways of controlling voting. But, and so immigrants face, immigration reform is called into those stations. As a human right, it would be easy to do it, but politicians go for votes. So how are we going to connect them?
So now, David, let's hear the activist point of view.
Sure, and that's something that I've thought about and worked with a lot is immigrant youth, undocumented youth, which you almost can't use the term anymore because people who were 25 when they started the activism are now in their 30s. You have a cutoff for who is considered immigrant youth. But I have worked with dreamers for several years now. The term dreamer comes from the Development, Relief, and Education of Alien Minors Act that was first introduced in Congress in 2001 and came close to passing a couple of times. And really was sort of the nucleus around which the undocumented youth movement, again, if you can call it that, formed. And it was out of the lobbying for that specific piece of legislation that undocumented youth from different parts of the country started to connect to each other, and also online. The internet was kind of an early incubator for people to connect to each other. You could be anonymous, you could be geographically isolated from each other, but people did start to have those conversations, and they started to collaborate to lobby for the DREAM Act. They started to have rallies and events where they would actively proclaim their undocumented status, coming out, sort of taking a page from the LGBT rights movement, with the idea that, as Harvey Milk said, when people know you, then they understand the issue better. It changes people's minds. If your passing is documented, then all they know is what they see on Fox News. This emerged to deportation defense, because as people were lobbying for the DREAM Act, they were getting deported. And we think we are in a moment now where we have DACA, deferred action. Dreamers are relatively protected from deportation, with some important exceptions, but that wasn't always the case. And so actually leaders in the movement were facing deportation, were getting locked up. And so other undocumented youth started working with lawyers like myself, with politicians, legislative offices, to stop individual deportations through public support and public awareness. That also gave visibility and strength to the movement. We had the first civil disobedience actions in May and July of 2010, most notably in John McCain's office in Tucson in May, around the date of the anniversary of Brown v. Board, in Senator Reid's office and several other Senate offices in July of that year. And lo and behold, about a month after Senator Reid was protested and had young Latino youth led out of his office in zip ties, he finally agreed to bring the DREAM Act out of committee where it had been stuck. Keep in mind, Democrats had control of both houses of Congress at the time and the White House, yet never introduced in good faith a comprehensive bill, and didn't even want to bring the DREAM Act up as a separate piece of legislation until they were protested against by undocumented youth. And this plan was not conceived of or executed by citizen-led advocacy groups. It was undocumented youth themselves. When the DREAM Act failed, and it passed the House, it failed in the Senate, and the undocumented youth saw the results of the election. The House went to the GOP. The DREAM Act was dead for the foreseeable future. And people were like, well, what now? We've been organizing around this piece of legislation, and it's not going to happen. And so organizers started to look beyond that and think about, well, how can we build a broader grassroots movement and look beyond just specific legislation. And then just a couple of points, that activism has developed over the last 2 or 3 years into prison infiltrations, where dreamers will actually conceal their status as dreamers, get arrested, get detained, and basically organize from inside jail and meet up with undocumented adults and essentially run these sort of public campaigns from inside detention, working with people on the outside. And then starting last year, we saw a series of border actions, which I've also been involved with, where deported or people who've been forced out by attrition, a lot from Arizona, Alabama, other anti-immigrant states, gathered and presented themselves at the port of entry and said, here we are, we're going to claim asylum, we want to reunite with our families, and are taken into custody, and most of them released into the United States to fight their cases. And so that's sort of where we're at with the activism that I've been involved with.
So we've painted, I think, a very broad and complex picture, and I've learned a lot this last hour. Now we're going to open it up to the floor. I'm sure people have questions. Please state your name and your class, and go ahead. Nico.
Nico Rodriguez, 2004 from college. I had 2 questions that are a little bit separate. The president used the strategy of really focusing on enforcement to try to build political support from Republicans for comprehensive reform by showing that he was very forceful in terms of enforcement and deportation, and the result has been historic record numbers of deportations. That policy hasn't really resulted in any political progress beyond the passage of the Senate bill. In reconsidering that policy, as well as concerns regarding violation of civil rights or detention quality, and the separation between his point of view of saying we're only going after criminal aliens versus the reality of Immigration and Customs Enforcement and CBP arresting or deporting individuals that are not criminals. Do you see the president really acting to rein in the work of ICE and CBP in the near future? A second question, which is completely separate, is realistically, are the policy priorities and the power of business interests and IT interests supporting comprehensive reform truly going to benefit the immigration reform movement, or is there going to be a break between people wanting temporary or high-tech visas and business-based immigration versus the vast majority who want family-based immigration? So I'm sorry it's a lot, but two big questions.
Well, the strategy of enforcement and deportation, I mean, I just don't see the logic behind it. It's like that the argument is that the Obama administration is doing all these things, hoping the Republicans, but there's never a negotiation. There's never a limit about how much they're willing to do. But what has happened in that process, which is actually something that we don't know what consequences it's going to have, is that we have privatized the whole system, and we have commercialized, and it has become, immigrant persecution has become part of the private prison industry, and there are lots of people making a lot of money, and now we have this economic actor that's working behind the scenes that we don't really know, with financing of elections and so forth. When I was in North Carolina doing research, and next to Chapel Hill, there is a county, Adams County, where the sheriff at that time built a jail that was 6 times the size what the county needed. And the sheriff was making money detaining immigrants. When I was visiting there a few years ago, they were expanding it with money, with federal money. And so we created that, and it's going to be very difficult to eliminate, I think. Now, on the side of the business sector, to me, that's the main actor that can get immigration legislation passed, immigration reform passed, and in my, when you look at history, depending on it might be easier to do it with a Republican president or something, but and so it's the business sector is this, just going with rights doesn't get too far, but the business sector is the one making the strongest argument for having immigration reform, and but it's not having a strong voice these days, and the divisions in the Republican Party, but it's I think either connecting with it. Certainly, they made their case with the high-skilled immigrants, which everybody sort of agrees high-skilled immigrants. It's ironic because when I look at Diana, I see a high-skilled immigrant. And it's ironic that discussion doesn't get extended to the dreamers, because you can say, we need to bring them from abroad, we have people trained here, speak English, but it has not extended that far. But to me, it's the main actor that can push it.
Maybe just a follow-up note on the question of administrative reform that's being kicked around in the media and in Congress. Is there a reasonable possibility of that comprehensive reform might pass this year? No. In the absence of comprehensive reform, is the president going to take administrative measures like he did with DACA, deferred action, and substantially expand those to parents and other undocumented people who don't qualify for DACA? I don't think that he is going to go as far as some people, as I hope that he would. What we've seen is a pattern over the last few years of sort of incremental measures that don't have a really significant effect, aside from DACA. Now, DACA, I had my doubts at first, but it's been a phenomenal program. It's left a lot of people out, but it has worked for those who qualify. But aside from that, every 2-3 months we'll get an announcement with a lot of media fanfare of some new reform that is inconsistently implemented often. It's not always carried out in good faith, and I think that's what we're going to get this time around, sometime this summer, or around, shortly before the election, possibly to try to get some sort of a boost from the Latino electorate. That's the pattern that I've seen. We've seen the Obama administration essentially flipping now from touting the deportation record to saying, oh, well, actually, no, we're not deporting all these people. The numbers are, not what we've been claiming. It's a very contested issue. But I just don't see it really happening in a very positive way.
Thank you. You have something to add, or you're...
No.
Wait. Next question.
Hi, my name's Ryan Milloway. I'm class of 13. So who are the major stakeholders? I guess what are their interests in policies? Who do you need to bring on board to move the legislation forward?
When it comes to major stakeholders, and if you ask the question, who needs immigrants. And the U.S. is going to need immigrants overall. Overall, the U.S. population is increasingly achieving high levels of education. I think that only 10% of the U.S. population today, of the younger generation, doesn't complete high school. Mexican immigrants coming to the U.S. have on average levels of education of 7 years of education. So they work in low-skill occupations. And if you want your population to have access to better jobs, there has to be the replenishment of the low-skilled workers. The main actor today when it comes to immigration from Mexico is the agricultural sector. It's still the main force pushing Mexican immigrants to come to the U.S. They enter the agricultural sector. In many cases, then they switch to construction, but the port of entry is the agricultural sector. That's why you're going to see there's always talk about temporary workers programs and so forth. And the agricultural industry is something that you can regulate because it's seasonal, and so it connects very well with the idea of sending people back after they're done. But there are industries that depend on immigrant labor which are more difficult to regulate, that are also connected to agriculture. One is the meat processing industry, for instance. The meat processing industry has always been an immigrant-dominated industry, and if you look at meat processing in the U.S. today, it's done by immigrants. And you might have noticed the changes in meat processing industry. We don't buy whole chickens anymore. We buy deboned chickens, pre-cooked chickens. All is done by a huge industry, meat processing industry that depends on immigrants. It's connected to agriculture and it's demanding immigrants, but they don't qualify for temporary workers programs. So, but what's going to happen with that, we don't know. The construction industry is another industry that depends on immigrant labor, but it's not, also again, it's not easily amenable to temporary workers programs. And then you have the high-tech industry, that the high-tech industry for some reason is the one that gains more momentum in terms of needing high-skilled immigrants. Because the discussion again, it goes, what kind of immigrants? We don't want the low-skilled because they bring poverty, they bring their families, they bring all these things. So it's easier to convince people about high-skilled immigrants for a while, and they are also the big stakeholders. The Democrats, with good reason, don't want to separate these different groups. They don't want to say, I just give concessions to the IT industry unless we do comprehensive immigration reform. Republicans always support immigration reform for high-skilled workers, and so they try to separate it. Democrats have it right that you have to do it. The problem is that this perception of the low-skilled worker is misguided. The low-skilled worker is as productive as a worker as the high-skilled worker. And I'm a high-skilled immigrant. And so that the perception that I'm so different from the low-skilled worker is just wrong. But it connects with issues of who we want here, ethnicity, identity, and all of those dimensions that kick in, that they are in the end, they are at the root of the problem. But it's that business sector that can push for these things. If you want to see the discussion on the negative side for immigrants, is that all this comes in terms of workers programs, either temporary workers programs or H-1B visas where the immigrants are tied to the employer. And so, and that's not ideal. You know, you will prefer a system where the immigrant has rights instead of being attached to the employer. But that's the way to go. I take it, but it's those are the main stakeholders. The main fear is when it comes to politicians and voting and changing the demographic composition of the local areas.
More questions?
I'm Peter Adlerman, class of 64. I happen to live in the Arizona desert, so I'm pretty aware of that stuff. It seems to me from the southwestern perspective that there's a disconnect between DACA and the actual implementation of the law. We see an awful lot of pretty arbitrary stuff going on in terms of who gets arrested, who gets deported. You probably know something about Operation Streamline, which seems to me to be highly questionable process constitutionally. Any comments on that?
Sure. We have seen some of the worst abuses of undocumented immigrants in Arizona. Unfortunately, and most famously with SB 1070, the legislation that was introduced or rather that passed in 2010, was later struck down in large part by the Supreme Court. That was essentially designed to force undocumented immigrants out of the state, and succeeded in many cases. I think one of the things that you're referring to as far as DACA not being fully implemented is that the political leadership in Arizona is essentially restricting the full benefits that DACA recipients see in other states, most notably the driver's licenses. Pennsylvania, somebody who has DACA can almost always get a driver's license or a state ID, and that just changes your life. And not having that in Arizona is a big problem. Other things that I've seen coming out of Arizona is just really unreasonable workplace raids and law enforcement, Joe Arpaio, and the typical pattern would be, there was one case that may still be going on, but she was a student eligible for DACA, was working under the table to get the application fees, which are nearly $500, was caught in a workplace raid, charged with some sort of document fraud, convicted, and then became ineligible for DACA because she'd been convicted of a crime. And the restrictions or the disqualifying crimes for DACA are just ridiculous. Shoplifting, simple assault, things like this, DUI, that would essentially result in a slap on the wrist for a citizen, can result in not only disqualification for DACA, but long-term detention and deportation. Just one general note on state versus federal enforcement of immigration laws. For a long time, this sort of mantra in immigrant advocacy was immigration is a federal issue, leave it to the feds, states should stay out of it. And we started to see that idea break down a little bit with Utah, what was called the Utah Compact. It was a different approach in sort of reaction to the Arizona approach, was to say, well, all right, we'll have some enforcement, but we'll also diverge from the really punitive federal enforcement and offer some benefits. And we're seeing that spread more and more now to all kinds of areas, not just states, but municipalities, like in Philadelphia recently, essentially cutting the tie between the police and immigration and ICE. And I think that's the right way to think about it. Think of the states and the localities as incubators for more pro-immigrant policies, where the federal government, in my view, is the source of much of the problems.
Yeah, I don't know how I feel about the local, the state or something, but it's something to pay attention, and that immigrants suffer a lot. What's happening these days is that somebody might be living in a sanctuary city, you might be living in Chicago, you'll be fine because they don't chase you, but then you step outside and they do chase you. And so, but there's a tension there, which more broadly, I mean, it reflects the tension in our political system between the tension between the federal and the local. And immigrants get caught in that. I told you the example of North Carolina. This was right next to Chapel Hill. Chapel Hill is a very liberal town, so immigrants were fine. But then they would step outside, go shopping, and so I found myself immigrants going around. This at that time was the 287G. And whether the county had this 287G enforcing this thing, and but the problem with those pieces of legislation, which is a broader problem, I mean, I don't have is that it keeps creating undocumented and illegal workers, because there's a new resolution that gets applied, and then it's sort of retroactively something that somebody did before suddenly makes you undocumented before you were fined. And so one of the things that it gets difficult to communicate is this kind of undocumented, is that undocumenting is produced by two things. One is the action of the immigrants, and the other is our legal system that doesn't match the behavior, doesn't match behavior. And in some cases, it's okay. You know, not all behaviors are okay, but sometimes there's some behaviors that get criminalized, and which is just not reasonable. And so you have this problem that the federal government tries to do something, and then the local area. So what's the solution? Are immigrants supposed to leave Arizona and go to places where they follow the federal government resolution, and that's the political tension. Let me just say that also this all got started in 1996, which was also a Democratic administration, and so that it's not clear. Again, this goes back to the issue. It's a Democrat-Republican issue. It's not clear where it comes from.
Oscar?
Oscar Benitez, class 2009. Know a lot about problems. But I was curious to know what's the, at least from your view, on, I guess, proactive solutions to moving, legislation forward. Because it seems that at least that a lot of it's reactionary. We can't wait for another Peopleson or a Sensenbrenner bill or Hazelton, right, coming out with their own ordinances. At the same time, if there's no one being the aggressor towards the undocumented community, it's a problem that continues to persist and doesn't bother anyone. Your food's still cheap, labor's still cheap. So I'm just kind of curious, what's, either from a student perspective or in the legal field or even academia, what's the latest as far as a proactive strategy? Because I ask myself this question because the media, in many senses, also been more sympathetic towards this. As a comment, Al Jazeera America is running a very good program on its borderlands. They effectively take U.S. citizens to investigate death cases of undocumented immigrants crossing the Arizona desert, and they retrace the journey. And they put this on the network, and it's done well when you rerun. Jose Antonio Vargas put out a new film, Documented, which is great. Filipino gay man, effectively coming out and sharing his story with the rest of the world, which is as complicated as I could only imagine. So there are a lot of different forces, I guess, sparking questions and identifying problems. But I'm just curious, from your point of view, what are concrete solutions as far as either identifying a face for a movement, millions of people getting arrested, and all of a sudden you have a massive reaction, and therefore the government needs to react? I'm just curious to get your thoughts on that.
David or Bennion?
So I think some things have already been said, right? So I think what has been said about having like frequent amnesty, or at least frequent like reanalyzation of immigration like legislation, I think is incredibly important and sort of does shift out of the reactionary piece, right? Because if it's something that you're constantly re-looking at and rehashing out, then that can become preventative, or at least can become more adaptable to the time. As we've spoken before, there's like a 30-year gap of like, what have we been doing for 30 years? I think that's a great solution. I think from a student perspective, the moment you said that, I was like, general knowledge. There's such a huge lack of knowledge as to what it means to be undocumented, how you can be undocumented. There's a huge lack of knowledge as to visa types. When I even start talking about the fact that there are various forms of visas, people look at me with a huge blank stare of confusion, like, what do you mean? There are more than one type of visa, but people don't know that. People don't know basic immigration law of the United States. So how can we even engage in conversations about immigration in the United States if we don't know that? And then again, bringing that broadly, if we don't know about immigration in outside of the United States, then we also don't understand the complexity of the issue, right? Because our immigrants don't come from the United States, they're coming in from other countries. So what is it about the other countries or our relationship with those other countries that makes it something viable or makes it something like possible for other people to come here and immigrate? And then I also think as an Ivy League, we have a lot of power. And I think that inter-Ivy League, we aren't doing what we can. Even having that conversation with administration is really hard. And even trying to get across what benefits does a university confer by making a public statement of support for undocumented students applying to the university. What does the university get out of that? I've been asked that several times. And the fact that that's even being asked, I think, is problematic. But, something that, from a student perspective, from someone who does deal with this every single day, a uniform system, like, I'm a DACA student, and I can't tell you how many times I've had to go into SFS just this semester because there's no uniform system yet on how the university deals with DACA students, because this is new legislation, but also because it didn't have a uniform stance to begin with. All undocumented students were completely put in a different pool and dealt with on a case-by-case status. And that's not just Penn, that's all universities, right? But if communication amongst us as an Ivy League, especially with the weight that our names hold, I think that we could be at the forefront of a lot of those conversations, and we aren't. And I think that from a student advocacy perspective, that's something that's incredibly frustrating for us, is that we want to sort of hone the skills that this university has taught us, one. And two, we want to do something with our degrees. If our degrees can't get us the jobs, if they can't get us the fellowships, if they can't get us the opportunities that our peers are being promised, well, listen, at the least, I want my degree to be able to help me advocate for that to be possible one day. And that's not currently possible today. So.
It's a question on a lot of people's minds, like, what's next? What are the next steps if comprehensive legislation is stalled? And I kind of think back to the Black Civil Rights Movement, and we have these landmark pieces of legislation in 1964 and 1965, the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. But when people think about the Civil Rights Movement, they don't necessarily think about the laws or the legislation as an endpoint, but we think about Martin Luther King and the imagery that he evoked, the ideas that he brought out, and him just as one member of a wider movement. It's not always known, but I was reading Michelle Alexander estimated something like 30 to 40,000 acts of civil disobedience took place during that time period. And as we've not reached anything near that scale with the immigrant rights movement. And so if we're thinking about something that took as long as the Black Civil Rights Movement and is still not at a terminus, it's still ongoing, are we in year 5 of a 20, 30, 50 year struggle? That's one thing that I think about. But what can be done as a practical matter, I look at what the undocumented activists are doing, the border actions I mentioned. There have been 3 so far that were organized on both sides of the border. The first had 9 people, the second 34, the third around 150. And then just 2 weeks ago, I was contacted by an activist in Mexico who said, there's a group of 1,200 people coming up through Mexico, refugees from Central America, from El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. And they're going to do the same thing, and they're going to present themselves at the border and ask to be allowed in. Is that going to have an impact on the public debate? Is it going to have a positive or a negative impact on possible legislation that's being discussed? There's a lot in the mix here, and I would just encourage us not to limit our scope to specific pieces of legislation.
Let me just add, and this goes back to the federal, the local. Immigrants still go to they're not evenly distributed across the U.S. 12% of the U.S. population is foreign-born, but not every place in the U.S. has 12%. Immigrants actually, Philadelphia is below the national average. It's still the main ports of entry, which are LA, Chicago, New York, Miami, and those places still concentrate most immigrants. So if you're going to if you want to avoid the federal discussion, you might actually support sanctuary cities. Instead of doing that, we're imposing ICE we're imposing secure communities on cities that don't want to persecute immigrants because they need them. Philadelphia will lose population without immigrants, and the same is Chicago, the same is New York. And so you might protect those cities from the federal government. Additionally, I think that the advocacy groups are right in just going after deportations. At some level, it's not so much about giving immigrants rights, just stop persecuting them. And if you stop deportations and then you stop all the negative effects of deportations, that's a huge accomplishment. In addition, I would increase the flexibility for employers to hire them legally, create some other temporary workers programs where it's impossible for employers to sponsor undocumented immigrants unless the restrictions there are just too many. So you increase the number of employer-sponsored visas, and you stop with this, and you might be able to. The main problem, it's not that the immigrants need to have an easy life and access to everything. The immigrants, you might say that they're paying the cost or whatever, but just don't persecute them. We're living in a context of really just open persecution.
And I think I'll tie it up with something, going back to what Diana said so eloquently just now. Two of her peers, Tania Chávez and Jose Gonzalez, both undocumented students graduating this year. What are they doing? They're going to go work for Teach for America, which is remarkable. They're giving back to a country that still won't embrace them. I want to thank all of you for coming here. Dr. Emilio Parrado, Attorney David Bennion, and Diana Estefania Estrada Alamo for participating, for educating us, for illuminating. And Diana, I wish you luck in this journey. I'm sure we'll be hearing more about you and probably having more conversations with you in the future. But I think know that you're in a good place, in a good time, and that you have friends at Alumni. Gracias a todos.